Mr. Sam Wilson, Honeywell Industrial Cybersecurity, for his presentation, The Disconnected Imperative and How It Impacts Industrial Cybersecurity.
Okay, everyone can hear? Great. Well, good morning. It's my first time to Kuwait and to speak at Kayak, and it's my sincere honor to be here. I wish we had more time together. If there's anything that you see that I'm presenting today that you'd like to ask questions on, please come and see me afterwards, and I'd be happy to share more detail. So I'd like to begin by telling you a story, by sharing a legend. And this legend begins around 1400 years ago, when perhaps one of the best strategists in battle and war realized that he had to set up his men with the very best resources to be able to achieve their missions, their targets. And at the time, one of the tools of war was to go on horseback. And so what he did was to test the loyalty of these horses. He withheld water from them long enough to make them very, very thirsty. And then when they were close to this beautiful oasis, he let them run, let them loose. And right as they were about to reach the water, he blew into the war horn. And that was their signal that they needed to return to their master for battle. And there were five mares and stallions that came back. And these beautiful creatures form the basis for something that this region is famous for today. You might wonder, what's the connection with cybersecurity? But if you stay with me until the end of the presentation, I'll explain what that connection is. So, I don't know if you can hear that. I tried to add some sound effects in the background. But there's these beautiful, beautiful Arabian horses are famous the world over still today. They were known for delivering mission-critical information to the commanders out on the field of battle. They were trusted companions and prized possessions of their owners. And they also acted as early warning systems to the troops. And these same horses are making an impact around the world still to this day. Unfortunately, even the fastest horses weren't fast enough because of what was coming next. The coming industrial revolutions demanded much more. And by this I mean that the spread of information was so important to the success of these teams that they needed more than what the horses could provide. So let's take a really quick walk through the history of different communication systems. You'll see some things and hear some things hopefully that you recognize in this part of the presentation. And we'll take it through until a quick regional focus on what the different options for communication and connectivity are in this region and globally, and what the impact to OT and to ICS would be. So the earliest communication systems, these telegraph systems, the best operators maybe could communicate at something like 30 words per minute. So how many of you recognize that sound? Isn't that a great noise? Some of you heard that so many times you could even look at that picture and tell me if it's the right modem or not, right? So I think a lot of us, when we got our first US robotics 56K modem, we just thought that was the best thing ever. But things quickly progressed past that through ISDN connections, and you could bond those together and get even faster bandwidth. Of course, DSL connections, and those top out at around 100 megabits per second. Cable, I don't know if cable connections are as popular here in the East as they're in the West, but those can achieve speeds of around 2 gigabits per second. And then, of course, you've got fiber, which is very common in this region, and right now it's approaching a terabit per second. We haven't seen the upper limits yet, but there's more to come there still. But there are some really innovative forms of connectivity that are on the horizon. Some of these are practical for commercial use, others not so much, but these will influence connection options globally, and so I'd like to just share a little bit about that. Ben touched on one of these briefly yesterday, but I'll explain a bit more on a couple of these here. So there's a project from Google called Project Loon. It was one of their moonshot experiments. And what they do with Project Loon, they have a series of high-altitude balloons that are connected from ground terminals, and then they're meshed together with a laser network. And these operate anywhere from 11 to 25 kilometers above the Earth. And they're very rapid, they're very quick to deploy to a region for connectivity. So for areas where there's been some kind of major disaster and all their telecommunications get wiped out, these balloons can quickly be deployed on site. But the interesting thing is the way that they navigate is they increase or decrease their elevation to catch the different wind currents that are traveling north, south, east, or west. And so places like Haiti, where there were very serious hurricanes that wiped out all of their telecom systems, Google was able to deploy a number of these Project Loon balloons to those areas to help with people that were on the ground. But beyond things like this, and there's a significant development change that's coming, and this is the one that Ben mentioned yesterday. So there's a bunch of different low Earth orbit satellites and providers that are on the verge of launching right now. And these have the low latency that have prevented satellites from being used for situations where there's not much tolerance for low latency. So there's going to be options available here that we haven't considered up until now. These have lower Earth orbits, as mentioned. They have speeds in the gigabit plus range. And there's some companies that will be providing these commercially starting in 2020. So some you've heard of. For example, the company founded by Elon Musk, also the founder of Tesla. There's his space company for launching rockets and satellites is called SpaceX, and their Starlink division is probably the furthest along in terms of a provider offering this service globally. They've already launched their first 60 satellites, and they've gotten permission for something like 12,000 before they're done. But there's a few others that aren't as well known, and it's worth keeping an eye on all of these to see which ones would meet the needs of your businesses. So there's companies like Amazon. They've got a project called Project Kuiper. There's another large one called OneWeb that's got a few very significant backers behind it. And there's a couple that are really geared towards IoT and the process control industry, surprisingly. So Swarm is one of those, and then LeoSat is another. And LeoSat has a lot of connections in the Middle East, so I think that's one that's worth watching for this region. Now, as impressive as these speeds are, we know that there's a lot more coming still. And the reason I thought it was important to talk about connectivity and the upper limits of these speeds is because as we have more and more connected systems, the amount of data that they generate is going to increase, obviously. And as companies decide to offload the processing of that data to external systems, and let's say it's a cloud service, having that low latency, high bandwidth throughput is very important. And most recently, there were some researchers that have announced they've achieved a sustained 1 petabit per second connection. That's unimaginable, and this is obviously carrier class technology, but that would be like sending an 8K video simultaneously to 10 million people. So that's almost hard for us to comprehend. But let's bring it back down to earth for a minute. There are some other technologies that I think are very close to being commercially available, and definitely some in the region. So one of those is what's going to be the next version of Wi-Fi. So right now you can get 802.11.AC. Wi-Fi version 6 or 802.11.AX is the next one that's going to be released. There are a few providers that are already offering this today. Cisco is one. They're just starting to have some models that are on the market. I believe Huawei is also looking at it. And the benefit of Wi-Fi 6 is greater capacity, something like 4 times the capacity. And the throughput is also much faster than what we have with the current models. So these would need to be hardened for your types of environments before they would be considered secure. But this is going to be available very soon. They are backwards compatible too, though. So as you consider looking at routers and switches or things that would support Wi-Fi, and you have different devices that are using older methods to connect, or older versions, this is still an option. And the other nice thing about the process control industry is battery life is very important for some types of devices. And with Wi-Fi 6, the keep alive time is much lower. So the battery life of these field units would be extended because of this newer technology. Now this is a very interesting topic for me here, especially in this region. In North America, they're only just starting to talk about 5G deployments. All of the carriers are excited about this. But there are very few regions globally where 5G is deployed on a scale that's meaningful. And I know that Kuwait is actually one of those. So through a partnership with Huawei, they've announced that 5G is commercially available in the region now. And it's not going to be used, I don't think, for all industries right away. And you might wonder, well, how does this apply to ICS? One of the great things about 5G is that you can deploy it over a private spectrum. So if you wanted to have 5G connections, and that little speed test on the right that I could watch all day long is a good example of the types of speed you can get on a local network over your own private spectrum. And so from a security perspective, having control over that is obviously very important. Now, like everything else, of course, there are security concerns with any new technology. There was a study done in 2019, earlier this year, by IRM, and they asked their audience whether they thought 5G would create any new security challenges for their organization. So this, close to 80-20 split is pretty typical. I would say that the 17% that don't have any concerns either don't know what the concerns are, or they're not thinking of deploying 5G. And then if you look at the top 3 challenges that came out of the survey results, the first was that there's a greater risk of attack on IoT networks. Well, I would suggest that any technology that you introduce will expose you to some extra level of attack. The wider attack surface, again, if you give the attackers a new target to go after, they're going to take the bait and they'll be interested. And then lastly, a lack of security by design in the 5G hardware and firmware. And really, if you abstract these concerns across any technology, I could take 5G out of those words on the screen and you'd see the same concerns applied. So the methodology that you would take to secure your system design is the same that you would apply to 5G. There's nothing special about it. Yes, there are security concerns, but they're really not that different from anything else that you've seen. Now we know, and this figure comes from 2014, but the number of legitimate industrial remote connections is something in the order of 360,000 per day globally. If you were to expand that to illegitimate connections, it would be up in the millions, obviously. But why is this important? Well, we know there's a growing theme towards connecting devices. And there are a few trends that impact this as well. Nobody would argue that there's this explosion in growth in the number of IoT devices that are coming online now. You'll see some of these within your environments, obviously. Your suppliers will also have them, and some of the things that Eric shared before are of concern because the attacks are coming upstream, no pun intended, and also impact your operations too. So if these double in size every 3 to 7 years, that's something else that you need to be considering as far as hardening your systems go. And after me, Peter is going to be also explaining a few concepts around org design and the roles of IT and OT for cybersecurity. And Gartner, and I think Sands has also indicated this as well, is that there's a shift that we're seeing right now. I believe a lot of you would be from what we would consider the IT side of the business. And we know there's a growing trend where the cybersecurity responsibility is shifting from the OT to the IT side, and it's either being managed jointly or it's the CISOs and the CSOs that are taking ownership of some of these things. This is important from a budgeting perspective, obviously. But also, as Eric mentioned, we need to be thinking about our supply chain. And when I introduced the topic of connected here today, I didn't want it to be limited just to connectivity from a technology perspective. We have to think of these systems as being connected on multiple levels so that we're considering how we can secure them across those levels. So there's obviously the technology. This is the first thing that comes to mind: your network, your hardware, your software. There's a lot of things you can be doing to whitelist not only applications but files themselves. This is something that Eric also mentioned. Your supply chain. There's some very well-known attacks that have been publicized where companies have gone out of business because they were compromised through one of their heating and ventilation suppliers or companies that did cleaning services. So you need to be vetting your suppliers as well and knowing the controls that they have in place, because if they're compromised, their systems could then in turn compromise yours potentially. And then of course people. So social engineering, there's a lot of people here today with expertise in that. Also the boundaries between professional and personal lives are sometimes blurring. So how many of you have policies in place to prevent the use of personal devices within your company environments? And if you have personal phones that your kids use, or they're plugged into maybe untrusted systems for charging or for updates or transferring files, are you letting those devices connect to your corporate networks? Now all of these themes and these trends, they combine to form what I would just call the perfect packet storm. As there's an increase in bandwidth, there's an increase in the number of connected devices, there's an increase in vulnerabilities, and not that there's any magic or mysterious thing happening here, but as the researchers become better to find vulnerabilities, and there are still, believe it or not, some vendors that don't follow proper security practices, these things combined produce the scenarios where the speed of the attacks and the magnitude of the impact are all increasing at the same rate. So with all of these concerns, why bother connecting ICS? Is it really worth it? Well, there's some obvious benefits that come to mind. There's price optimization. So you've got a scaling effect, obviously, in the cloud. If you've got providers that offer things at a scale that is hard to compete with, that's one tangible benefit. I think Joel would argue that maybe it's cheaper to have things on site than in the cloud. But there are models where this makes sense, and so it's worth exploring based on your own situations. Remote support. Now, this is controversial because once you start connecting your systems, you're potentially exposed to other types of attacks. However, you also want to get rapid support from your vendors, and so without a secure connectivity solution, it's very hard to enable support from off-site. And this, of course, has other benefits besides time to support. Travel costs are also reduced. Time to value. A lot of the providers that offer these connected services, they're introducing new capabilities much faster than you could build them in-house. And being able to leverage those gives you competitive advantage, which in today's world is very important. Time to market is very important. So being able to tap into your data and gain insight quicker is something that many companies are interested in right now. And then lastly, there's a force multiplier effect. So especially with threat intel, it's the wisdom of crowds effect, that the more sources you're able to confirm against and query, the more precise your threat intel should be. This is a very important effect in cybersecurity. So there was a study done in 2018 by the ITU, and this was mentioned in one of the presentations on the first day. And I thought this was very interesting. And actually, before you get too hung up on the fact that Kuwait is listed last here, what I wanted to say is I think this is actually the wrong message. If they were to resurvey today the same questions, based on what I've heard this week and what I've learned coming into the conference, I'm pretty confident Kuwait would actually rank higher than 6th on this list. There's a lot of very good things that are happening right now here in Kuwait. But more importantly, and some of your own leaders have even stated this in other events that they've spoken at, what's important is the knowledge sharing and the collaboration between the countries and the states that are listed. The strength in cybersecurity really does come from sharing information that's suitable to share for the benefit of others. And this might mean being a little bit vulnerable in what you're communicating, but if it's with a trusted party, the benefit is mutual. And so I would suggest that these ranking lists really don't serve a lot of value. It's much more important to be collaborating with your peers in the region. All right, I'll go through the next couple of slides fairly quickly. There's some new cloud services that are coming online in the Middle East that are worth noting. Amazon Web Services, they have a point of presence in Bahrain already, and understand that they signed a deal to have a point of presence in Kuwait earlier this year. Microsoft Azure, they've got 2 different regional sites set up already, and there's some case studies as well set up on a couple of different businesses here in Kuwait. And again, afterwards, if you have a copy of the presentation and the speaker's notes, I have a link to some of these different case studies. And I took the time to compile a list of all of the different cloud services that both Amazon and Microsoft were providing. And then I took time to filter those so that there was a regional list that I came up with. And I have the full list that I'm willing to share afterwards if you come and see me. But you'll see that they don't automatically provide all of the cloud services in all of the regions. There's a kind of phasing in process that occurs. And it might look like Microsoft is a little bit further ahead in terms of total number and total available in the region. But I assure you that there's great interest on the part of all of the cloud providers. It's a race to be present here to offer services to customers in the region. All right, this point's been made before, but that's that if you're under attack, you may not be the real target. What do I mean by that? Well, so we know that the attacks are coming in different forms. A lot of them are basically taking the form of what we would have called the Trojan horse at one time. But they're also coming in the form of different types of attacks on personal systems. So there's phishing, vishing, mishing. These all have different definitions. And beyond that, we're seeing creative attacks as well in the form of different connected devices themselves. So there was a threat report that Honeywell issued last year, and we took a random sample of 50 different locations. We have a USB security solution called Secure Media Exchange, SMX, and we looked at sample data from 50 different customer sites, and we found actually that in 44% of those locations, during the sample period, which was only 1 month, there was some type of malware that the systems picked up. And out of those 44% of the locations, 11%, it was a type of threat that your traditional AV would not have picked up. So what does that mean exactly? So there's what I'll call non-software based attacks that we're starting to see showing up in the wild. They're academic largely right now, but these are starting to convert into real world scenarios. They all have cute names, but I assure you that they're not cute. So one of these is bad USB. This is never going to tell you it's bad USB, but that's what's happening behind the scenes. You've got things like rubber ducky, and these can act like a keyboard. The significance of this is if your security controls don't prevent your operators from plugging in a USB device, whatever permissions that user has, the USB device has on your system. And you might say, well, we don't allow USB storage devices to get connected. Well, do you also block USB keyboards? And if you don't, you should be thinking about it or authorizing or whitelisting those, because a rubber ducky can present itself to the computer and say it's a keyboard and execute commands at over 1,000 words a minute. And you would not have time to react to the windows opening and closing and the commands that are flying across the screen. It would cause damage before you could respond. And then besides Rubber Ducky, there's the Bash Bunny, and this is a fully fledged mini Linux computer running on a device that is not much bigger than most thumb drives, and these are still shrinking today. And then we've also seen researchers weaponizing the cables themselves. Most recently, they can actually embed a cellular connection inside the USB charging end of the cable, or they can be weaponized to cause physical damage to the systems that they're plugged into. So these are all sorts of different types of attacks you need to be considering with your security controls, and I consider these to be part of that connected conversation. There was a study done in the region a couple of years ago to categorize all the different types of USB attacks. Some of them I mentioned earlier. Again, if you'd like a copy of this, come and see me afterwards. But doesn't it feel like these USB devices are becoming more universal? I found out this week that even the Shisha, there's an e-Shisha version now. And these things, you can plug them in to charge a little element or coil and charge it by USB. And there are some theoretical attacks that we've also demonstrated at previous conferences where an e-cigarette, this is what the gentleman on the left is holding, where these could contain a weaponized version of something that looks like an innocent device entering your facility. So what can we say towards the conclusion here? We know that which was secure yesterday, you might recognize the machine in the background here, may not be secure today. And by that I mean there are different computing platforms coming out, and so this is the picture. Honeywell surprisingly is in the quantum computer space. We know that quantum computers can break encryption much faster than conventional computers. So that which was secure yesterday may not be secure today, but the same quantum computing technology is being used for quantum cryptography and satellite transmission. So if you combine those capabilities with the connectivity that I mentioned earlier, you've got a very robust, powerful communication mechanism. Okay, just a few quick random practical thoughts. Your asset inventory is never complete. Why does this matter from a connected perspective? If you don't know the devices that are on your network and you don't know who they're talking to, then you're probably exposed. Connectivity, I can't not mention data diodes. Do they work everywhere? No, but use them where they make sense. Don't just whitelist your applications, whitelist your files as well. When your people have to connect to the internet and use a browser, there are techniques that you can use today to make that more secure. And then, of course, there are new types of attacks that we also need to think of in the connected context, and those could be, we've seen examples of drone attacks, not only from a kinetic perspective, but drones can carry Wi-Fi access points on them, they can drop malware. And lastly, does your IDS and your IPS, can it handle steganography-based attacks where there's malware hiding inside of media files or documents, for example? We're not seeing a lot of this yet, so this is another vector that I think needs to be considered. Okay, so closing thought here. Assume that you will be breached, and this is maybe an uncomfortable statement, but the reality is that the attackers eventually get by most defenses. So if you assume that you're going to be breached, don't just have a disaster recovery plan. You want to have a disaster transformation plan. And by that I mean, don't just get back up to baseline. Have plans in place that when you go to restore, you can actually exceed and implement technology that's beyond what you had in place before you were taken out of commission. So lastly, my wish for all of you is that you would become cybersecurity horses in the region. You would deliver critical cybersecurity intelligence. You become seen as trusted protectors and respected leaders in the region, but also that you would carry your innovation to the world. Thank you.